Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pico. My name is Juan Francisco Muñoz, and I'm as always joined by my colleague Ronan Wordsworth. How are you doing, Ronan?
Very good, very good. We've had a little bit of interruption over the summer with travels and you finally finishing your master's.
I'm about. No, don't curse it.
But we're happy to be back here and trying to record some very interesting episodes for you.
Yes, it's definitely been an interesting year. I feel like this year has been lasting for 5 years because I can't, when I think about what we were talking about in January or in September last year, it feels like the world has changed a lot. So we definitely have topics.
Is that to do with the White House's activities or?
With Europe, it's got to do with Brazil, with China. I mean, there's many actors that have been moving a lot throughout this year. And today we're going to focus on NATO. And for that, we're really happy to welcome Mr. Jakub Landovský. He is the former ambassador and permanent representative of the Czech Republic to NATO from 2019 to 2024. And more recently, he was the executive director of Aspen Institute in Central Europe. So thank you very much, Jakub, for coming with us today.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for having me, guys.
We're really happy to have you here, and given your experience within NATO, we would like to start talking about the sense of importance of NATO among its member states. We've had many conversations, especially this year, we will come to it, about the commitment of the member states, about the communication cooperation between the member states within NATO. So how has NATO's importance changed or evolved since you started being the representative of the Czech Republic until now?
Excellent question, because NATO has a long history, but it's also a creature that shifts every period of time. It takes care of the security of 1 billion people with its institutions and all the power of the nations behind NATO. But I was coming at a time of breaking of the periods. We were still engaged in Afghanistan, but I truly believe we're going to achieve something grand there. Also, Americans were really heavily invested into shifting the alliance focus from the regional security, Russia, namely, and terrorism as the number one threat for the past 2 decades, from the 2000 onwards. And it's beginning to take hold, but we are already on a path to the big war in Europe because the smaller war started in 2014. So everything is laid in front of me. My first summit was in London, so space was a big thing, but also the first ever mention of China. And I remember how countries were acting before Ukraine, after Ukraine, before seeing troops from Northern Korea on the battlefield and after. And some things in my head they cannot be undone. And the sense of, being in NATO for the expert community and for the people, it's still a hard currency in the world security, because currency is a relative thing. There is no better guarantee for a state for its security in terms of collective security arrangement than NATO. But on the other hand, NATO was born under slightly different conditions. When Europe was much more important and the Cold War was brewing, and it got a big hit of raison d'etre after the Cold War ended. Its renewed purpose in fighting terrorism, but then its old role became important again, and even more so than the terrorism that is now considered as a second-degree threat to NATO countries. So it went from this, slow decline, reinvigorating the purpose in the Balkans, going up with the terrorism, which started to be unfulfilling in terms of achieving the objectives. And then the big old foe of NATO, Russia, strikes again. And everything comes to place, I think. So now there are many more reasons to see the importance of NATO for the member states and for the expert community. But on the other hand, the organization is changing its internal wiring to sustain the credibility issue, and we can talk about it in more detail now with the drones flying to many NATO countries through their airspace, how to keep the credibility, effectiveness, and the political wiring of the alliance together in one meaningful organization. That's the eternal question for the organization.
I think you put on a few interesting threads there I'd just like to touch on. I think when you joined as the Czech Ambassador 2019, obviously very different period to what we're in now, was during Trump's first period of office. And you mentioned like during that period before the war in Ukraine, the first time China was mentioned as the main adversary. And I think for the US, my understanding is that's been their main strategic shift to focus more on China, while Russia potentially can be a European issue. And so they're trying to potentially shift that burden onto the Europeans. Does that sound accurate? And like, how has that played out, especially after Afghanistan? As you said, though, searching for a new direction. We see the two blocks almost within NATO looking opposite directions.
We are all geopolitical creatures, so I'll speak about geography as well, because, you know, we Europeans are too focused on ourselves. America always see the planet as a whole, as a round world. And the main objective of the American policy in the world in terms of geopolitics is always to prevent the grand alliance in Eurasia or Asia. And Europe is a periphery of Asia in geographic terms, no matter how you slice it. And you are absolutely right. And I'm one of the very few people in this country that have an understanding and even a soft spot for Donald Trump, because he's both. He's easy to understand, and he has certain, even though people say otherwise, he has certain, let's say, a continuity in his thinking. And focusing on China was first Trump, Biden, and second Trump. Always. Only the focus or the, brisance of the whole thing changed now with Aldrich Colby, for example. But it's always there, and Europe was always nurtured to take more. But Europe was unwilling, because Europe is always very opportunistic and try to get the best out of the situation, regardless of the long-term shit. So you are absolutely right. This was the moment. But Americans decided to untie their hands with Afghanistan. And I never truly understand. I understand some things, like why was relationship with Russia important in the first phase of Afghanistan war? But now Afghanistan is on the crossroads between China, Russia. It's right at the center of the heartland. But somehow they decided there is no point of being there, heavily invested, and they left. And that occupied us for a bit. But I never, get out of my radar the fact that we Europeans are unwilling, unfit, and reluctant to take the security challenge of our time, which is not the biggest one, that's China, and that's Russia. And somehow we just thought that either America will save us or will handle it. But we never really handled it through Minsk or any other arrangement. We were too weak, divided against Russia, which is also not the strongest country in the world. But they have certain perks and unity that allows it to disrupt the European security environment. And they will never, and that's important, they will never go against China in the foreseeable future. And they will never go into Pacific region, because they feel, rightly so, there is no place for a second-degree power in the region. So they will use what they have, the perks of nuclear, parity with the US against Europe, and namely against Central and Eastern Europe. And that was a lot of fun to try to organize NATO caucus of Central and Eastern European countries for the cause of new policy against Russia. But it was also slightly against the American attempts to get in touch with Russians and to appease them, because they didn't really want it, the war in Ukraine. That's true. They didn't want it. Trump. And I think even Biden administration was not happy about it, because that's what getting China stronger and us weaker, the war in Ukraine.
So then we've mentioned these two blocks. No, one is America. Given their military and economic power, they are obviously the central member of NATO. But then you're also mentioning that Europe fails to see its objectives as well. So we can understand that there are several brands of NATO within NATO in Europe. I'm coming from Spain. The perception of Russia is different than the perception that there is in Central and Eastern Europe.
It's visible.
It's visible, no, for sure. How has the collaboration then between states evolved prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And then maybe we can get into today later on, but how did it evolve? Did the countries that were at different poles, particularly in Europe, come together to collaborate, or was it more difficult than that?
First, there was a shock of the war because nobody in the West truly believed that the Russia's gonna attack. The Americans brought a very clear intelligence, and they even said what the direction would be, what the time would be. Everything was like top notch. The opposite of this was the fortress Kabul, Afghanistan intelligence, just completely off the reality environment. But after the attack, there were some very pessimistic voices. It was not Spain that said, it's going to be over quickly. Let's get it be over quickly because Ukraine might not suffer necessarily for too long. They will lose anyway. And there were those, including, Poland, Czechia, Great Britain, US, that started to help, and give it a chance type of approach to Ukraine. Spain was always trying to maintain its own national priorities together with Italy before Meloni. Italy after Meloni is different, but it was a creature of reminding us terrorism, migration, and the Spanish rationale. But also it was trading heavily with Russia, even more so now, which I think really upsets Washington. Washington is transactional, brutal, but not too hypocritical. Europe is very hypocritical. And when we get into this business of helping Ukraine and counting the money and defining, which was our biggest Achilles heel, defining the war objectives, which were never defined in Ukraine in a precise sense, we discovered that every nation is fulfilling its role in help very, very differently. And all of the European nations are still somehow helping Russia, either openly or covertly through Georgia or. And I think Spain is one of the biggest importers of Russian fossil fuels now. There were many countries that were buying.
Yes,
And I love numbers. And if you get the total amount of money we were sending to Russia 2022 and 2023, it will head up the oil and natural gas. It was more than we sent to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot, in geopolitics specifically, pull on the both sides of the rope hoping you're going to win. That's impossible. And America sees that. And I was in the room in the Trump's first presidency as a deputy minister when he was shouting at Angela Merkel, "You really think that we're going to say to you in front of Russia that you feed every day with your money for the oil? You really think so? No, it's not going to happen, not on my watch." So these things are recurrent. Like I said, Trump has continuity. And now they are visible in the Trump's letter. That's all over the Twitter now. Please get behind us in tariffs and stop buying Russian oil. We'll put all might and weight on your side in the Ukrainian conflict, which basically could resolve a lot of things, but also dispel the hypocrisy of Europe. So as I said, in the beginning, when the NATO started to refocus after the shock, the national interest started to prevail and the common European behavior became apparently hypocritical because we were slow to get in helping Ukraine enough and not limiting Ukrainian war effort so Ukraine can really do something meaningful on the battlefield. The Germans' policy and others that said, yeah, we'll deliver weapons, but we'll forbid you to use them very efficiently on the Russian territory.
Definitely. And I think if we look at the evolution, say, in the lead up to the war, you said there was very good intelligence from the US.
Yeah.
This is the direction that Moscow was heading, and yet nobody really believed it. And so we had Germany, which I guess is a continuation of 50 years of foreign policy of Germany, increasingly looking to not even attempt to deviate or from an energy security perspective to diversify away from Russia. They were already constructing Nord Stream 2 at the time of the attack there. And so we've seen like this has been a continuous warning from the US over 50 years, I think, for Europe to take this threat seriously if they want the US support on this issue. I think that's a good point to raise there. And then from that, now we see within the EU, there is still kind of this very fractious relationship between different member states. I think we have obviously Slovakia and Hungary still taking in large amounts of Russian oil and gas. And then we've got, say, Czech Republic and Poland on the other side trying to mobilize arms and ammunition for the Ukrainians to be able to fight back. And how did that dynamic really play out for you? I think the Czech was obviously in charge of the Czech ammunition initiative. I'm sure you were heavily involved in that as well, and trying to get these converging views within the same bloc to be able to unify our position.
Oh, yeah. There is something really interesting, and that's for experts, because not many people from the journalists would understand, but there is something called B9 in NATO. There is something called the Quad. And the Quad means the four biggest allies. It's the US, UK, France, and Germany. And they have a consultation mechanism among themselves. And when Poland, President Komorowski, back then, like 15 years ago, discovered that this is a very powerful tool, he said, but our region always pays for these big power deals or grievances. Let's find something which will unite the countries that are mostly endangered by Russia, including Hungary back then, and we call it B9, which was combining. No, Visegrad was V4.
V4, yes.
And it was like V4 plus B3 plus Romania and Bulgaria makes the B9.
Yeah. So the entire shatter belt between Central Europe.
Perfect.
Russia.
And that was my tool of the trade, to get those countries first, and then to try to invite France or UK or anyone willing to talk to us and try to split the Quad, which was the general idea of Komorowski, to put some, wedge in between European powers and the US, or Germany and the US, because they were always more reluctant on certain issues, like keeping Russian policies intact, for example, not generated new ones. So, and then the Hungary fall off, so we had to invent something new, so it was B8. It's like, if Hungary wasn't on board, we met with Hungary and continued. But if you see geopolitically in Europe, in NATO, there are like three big groups. There is the Hanseatic, northern, German, I would say German-induced group that cares about security. It's slightly slower moving, but it's genuine in aligning words with money. Then there is France, and it's a disaster, and I'll tell you all about it. But France is an unnamed leader of a bloc called the Southerners that would always be more fractured, more focused on Africa and terrorism, and less able to see the Russian problem or Russian aggression as the biggest threat to their security. They are tucked in geographically behind the blanket of the shatter belt of the Central and Eastern Europe. And then you have the Romania, for example. It's a contested territory in certain sense, but it tries to be part of this Northern Hanseatic bloc, which is now much stronger because of Sweden and Finland, which is the biggest geopolitical victory of my era. I was also blessed to sign the documents for the Czech Republic, so my ugly signature is under a very important document called the Accession Protocol, Finland and Sweden. And this creates a dynamic that's very historic, because it's the Protestants versus the Catholic. It's very geopolitical, and it works. There is certain like-mindedness in the group. It's fascinating, really, like to talk about the country's positions and the personal ties. Somehow you can really tighten the screw a little bit if you know the man or the lady on the other side of the table. So it was combination, but the political lines were always very clear in Europe, and these are the biggest blocks that I see. And then you have a Turkey.
Yeah.
Turkey is, I think, the geopolitical victor of this era in NATO and in the region, because they get the best out of all worlds, and they gain a lot of traction and power through the development of the latest years.
Yeah, their geopolitical position is clearly of MD. It's a historical geopolitical position as well, somewhere between the east, the west, the north, and the south. It's in the middle of everything and can participate of everything. And
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, I would actually we did one episode on Turkey some
years ago. It's something we have to revisit.
Yeah, we should visit it.
If we look right now, that Ottoman
with Neo-Ottomanism
views of Erdogan,
Middle East. And then when we talk about perception of belonging of people to nation states or to states, we're talking about this sentiment of shared common values, shared culture, for them to feel like they are part. And that sense of belonging is needed for the state to work properly according to theories. How is this sense of belonging within NATO for the member states?
NATO is amazingly able to spread its own culture with certain limits. For example, France will always have a different set of policies based on a very different position in NATO, which stems from the nuclear reality, from the Gaullistic departure from NATO, and Sarkozy's return, if I'm correct. I think it was under Sarkozy when they returned to the military structures, I think 2009 or something. So France will
After they left with the
Charles de Gaulle.
They left with the Gaulle, in the 60s.
So they are very, very distrustful, different, but also hefty. So they need to be reckoned with. And they used to be a big player in Africa, but not anymore. Mm-hmm. They used to be a big player in Pacific region, and they prevented NATO to get there. But it's hard for them now. It's the Kanaks and whatnot. They are not really getting better position by the day. They are losing geopolitically. So they would reconsider and recalculate what's the benefit of doing something through NATO, I think, even in the Indo-Pacific. And then you have strange animals like Iceland, for example. They don't have an army. They are part of the military structures, but they don't have any soldiers. So it's very diverse. And then you have the newcomers versus the founding members or the old Europe. And that's also a very distinct division line in NATO. For example, the infrastructure ends in the Western German border. It doesn't even go to the Eastern
Cold War era.
It's Cold War era. And so it's the homage to Russia in the terms of NATO-Russia Founding Act, which basically prevents the large-scale military units being deployed in the new member states. Are still things that are making NATO a two-speed organization. And one of my biggest wishes was to dismantle that, to have an organization which is homogeneous and in which, which is truly international in terms of unitary voting, unequivocal support for things proposed at the table, which is different than in EU, where you have the QMB, qualified majority voting, right? It's very traditional. So you have this traditional sovereign states type of dealings, but you also have a NATO culture, which is America's induced, and old Europe, I think, thrived under the Cold War era. I think it was the best era in terms of economic growth and stability you can imagine, right? Even though countries are spending 4% on the defense in 70s, for example.
I was going to come to that, bringing it to now, I guess, Donald Trump's second term starting in January this year. We've seen his big push for 5% spending, of which 3.5% for military, 1.5% for infrastructure. Is that infrastructure budget designed to bring these eastern areas up to speed and make it sort of able that, I guess, NATO can cover that ground? Because my understanding at the moment, to mobilize to the far east of NATO would take a long time because you have to go over different rail structures, different road infrastructure is not there, and it really needs this big infrastructure investment to be able to be fit for purpose if the threat is coming from the east there.
Very acute observation, Ronan. It's perfect because you need to compensate the vastness of space to the area of operation by quick mobility, by rapid movement, which is a force multiplier in itself, but it also allows for credible reinforcement. Isn't NATO all about credible reinforcement across the Atlantic? That's why we used to have someone called Saklant, which was the commander of the Atlantic, responsible for the US being able to help Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. The same should be, bridged in terms of the infrastructure in the Central and Eastern Europe, but also in cyberspace, because I think we cannot now really divide the physical space only problems and set aside the fact that in cyberspace we need to connect into a network which communicates across this physical space that we need to protect.
And that's an area where Russia has been particularly astute at probing. I guess if we look at the eastern flank, they've tried again over the years, trying to just not even large-scale attacks, but lots of small-scale penetrative attacks in the cyberspace to see where they can find openings.
So death of NATO's credibility by 1,000 cuts. That's their goal now, and trying to get to the bottom of their strategy. But I think it's exactly this. Would you imagine Russia in 2004 would endanger NATO airspace? Not really. Now they are bolder and bolder by the day because the response is not strong enough to forbid them from doing so. But it's better because Poland started to shoot down the drones. But you mentioned the money, and money is, it is mostly, it's a serious organization in which I think every year we gather together as sovereign nations and put into one system, but only a command system, 1,400 billion $1,400 billion, $1,400 billion. But of that sum, 70% is American budget, slightly more because it's almost $1 billion now. It's 960, right? And there you see that America spends only 3.637 because it's such a growing economy. And when you see that, you start to realize that Europe have to overcompensate by spending more to get somewhere in defense because Europe is falling down in economic terms. And that's the biggest problem.
And on that, I mean, I think some of the European credibility has to come from level of strategic autonomy. That is being able to make weapons and ammunition here within Europe.
Exactly, yeah.
Because if we look at Ukraine now, I mean, the US has cut off early this year, providing new tranches of weapons and ammunition. And then the Europeans said that they would buy it from the Americans. But again, that doesn't make sense from the European economic perspective. You're now spending money in the US market rather than developing capacity here within Europe. I know there has been a big push for this autonomy for a long time, but I guess you've brought up France before, so I'll go back to them. How does this play out at a European level when you've got different actors all with their own goals and not working together? So we have France looking for French weapons and ammunition to be the standard. Czech have CZ, which is a very prominent weapon manufacturer here, and then we've got the Germans and everyone playing their own game. I think
NATO had one goal, and that's interoperability or even interchangeability of weapons and ammunition within the capability portfolio. But Europe was so protective of its national champion that it destroyed this idea. So, for example, if you buy French guns, like we are buying the Caesars, you have to either pay a lot of money for certifying your production to be used in the Caesar, or buy only the Caesar's ammunition. It has two parts: legal part, which is like the warranty and stuff. And also, always when you are shooting a new munition, you need to calibrate the gun again. But it's not a problem. That's a normal thing. But everybody was trying to seize their part of the market. Problem of Europe is it doesn't create a true market in which you compete. It's a fighting arena for national interests. And the states are using the power in the EU to get business for their companies, which are usually sucking to the tit of their own state. France is talking about the European defense market, but buys 90% of what it buys from French producers. Makes sense, but not really, because in Europe you need to find like three categories of, sophistication in weapon systems and face the consequences of not being able to make all three of them. First is the basics, and let there be a huge competition in munitions, small caliber, big caliber, protective gear, soldiers, basic stuff. Let there be open. NATO standards, European standards are the same. Let's compete. If you fail, we fail fast and get out. But there is the mid-segment, like a tank or a new fighter jet, in which we should group. There is no point in making for every bigger European country their own tank. Doesn't make sense. But how to make it so it is competitive, that's a big question, because just to bundle up countries doesn't ensure the competition. And then there is the third layer. And in this, we should shut up, because we don't have it. And there is no chance you're going to have it soon. And that's the space capabilities, that's the nuclear, and that's the fifth generation fighter and beyond. Mm-hmm. That's the highest degree of cyber capabilities, AI-driven things, and Europe is really lagging behind. And you are absolutely right. We should, throw down the veil of modesty. We should be strong in weapons, and that should make our normal industry stronger. But we should also make our overall industry stronger by saying what we're going to be best at. And I never heard it from Europe. US wants to be the best in AI, hence the energy scheme to power up the fields of computers. China wants the same because they feel that the offset strategy for 21st century will be focused on AI and space. Europe is not big in space, not big in AI, and throwing more hurdles into normal usage, commercial, and the military usage of, for example, AI. So what are we going to be good at?
Do you think, because we are talking about the European integration here,
Yeah.
so do you think this integration could be done in a framework that is not NATO? Let's say this integration through the EU mechanisms, for example, of something like the common agrarian policies, but applied to things, artificial intelligence, things about weapon systems and stuff, because what I perceive is that within NATO, that would also create the bloc of Europe. And I don't know how would the United States react to that, for example.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. And we spoke about money, so we'll infuse the money into the transatlantic equation, into the, how they want us to be, how we want to be, how it's going to work together in this partnership. First of all, this partnership is inevitable. Since Europe is unable to protect itself in a nuclear domain, and our, British and French arsenals even combined are 1/10 of the Russian arsenal. And numbers matter. Europe says, no, it's a weapon that will have never be used. No, its deterrent is based on numbers and capabilities to deliver. And in this, we are lagging behind. US will have to face a situation of nuclear standoff with China and Russia being really together. And has a huge geopolitical quality in terms of sharing the sensors, the picture. Russia provides the northern picture. China provides the Pacific picture. And that combined is a tremendous advantage in the, nuclear posture. Then you have the sheer numbers. China is growing so fast and they want to be on par with Russia. That means 2 against 1 in the same numbers. And that's a disaster. So US will have to compensate. And they never subtracted the nuclear umbrella from the European countries. So we have to compensate elsewhere because this is something we're not going to be doing. And they are doing it for us. Without it, we are doomed in the 21st century to be someone else's, slaves in some areas. Listen to Moscow or China or whatever. So this is our only chance. Then you have the AI. And in this, we should really start to think about it differently. We are talking about the impact on the university environment, on the labor market. It's a service. You got to pay for it. You are always doing it. It's a good business. Electricity system. And there are 2 hurdles for the AI for Europe to get rid of, and that's the high energy prices and the data policies that are preventing AI to use the data of the European citizens. And then we can go further and further. Your question was poised on whether the US would like it. Not really. But we should try to, as Europeans, live in a world where we don't care about whether people likes what Europe is doing or not. But we are able to carry on because we are not being overly dependent, or, we have enough power to project our policies against others' will. And that's the definition of conflict. You are acting against someone else's will and interest. And we are lacking both because for both of these projects, you need to be united. And the European market is not finished. So first, I'd like to repair the European economy. Ursula von der Leyen, and they said that she had a warlike costume. I didn't see it. I think it was a very normal costume. But she said 2028... it's going to be the date when she will finish the single European market. Big ask, but let's do it. And from that, which is, I think, in the DNA of Europe, we can do something in defense, but we are getting head over heels doing defense, which is not in the treaties, which is heavily invested by the national champions I spoke about. It's too much. So let's do the market first. But that means that, for example, Spanish entrepreneurs will listen to German law, for example, because you cannot have a single market if you don't have a single bankruptcy law. You need to choose. Ask the French people whether they will listen to the German law or the German people will never. And that's a fallacy. So you can never really have it. And that's also about the free flow of capital. That's why the European investors, I don't know where you are investing, what you have, if you are investing, it's the US. So this Trump deal with Ursula, it was the same amount of money for next 3 years that was already spent the last 3 years, this 600 billion. Because anyone is investing in America. People are fleeing from here to there because of the environment. So let's repair the environment. And then you can thrive in terms of policies. But the policy you mentioned, the agricultural policy, it's a big hypocrisy towards Africa. And we are all, as I know, both of you guys, looking towards the continent. When we started the European Union, we said it will all be open except for the agricultural policies. We seal up ourselves from Africa. And now we are offering lectures, I don't know, in statecraft, instead of buying something that they make. And that's a problem because we are hypocritical, building something and kicking the ladder of those who wants to join in some way or the other. And we are paying a lot because nobody wants to really work in agriculture. And it used to consume like 60% of the budget. Now it's below
40%.
40%.
Somewhere around.
So this is changing. Good. Because it used to be most of the money was used for that. It was like a social, it was no longer a business. It was so competitive. It was like Brussels will decide and you're going to grow or not grow something and get the money for.
Exactly. That's the point exactly, because in that policy, I do understand the blacks of this policy because in Spain it's quite important. But as you said, this policy what made was that countries could not produce certain things so that other countries could access the market.
Yeah.
Case that is that we have back home is that we overproduce agriculture on every sort of agriculture that you can consume in the European Union. So France was like, no, because if the European market comes, if the Spanish market comes that is cheaper, it's going to crush my own agriculture. And that's why we do this. And I understand that this common agrarian policy is based on a lot of subsidies, but it's also based on a lot of subsidies because there is a big part of the population that is directly dependent on agriculture, whereas there's not a large amount of population that is dependent with their labor force in weapons industry, for example, or in artificial intelligence. So applying this principle of dividing so that we can all produce together in a way and it becomes a little bit more stable, that's what I mean if something like this could be applied or could be explored in order to have a common output in the end. Because it is true that, as you're saying, if the situation remains as it is, French companies are not going to give away their part of their ammunition production, let's say, so that a Czech company can produce ammunition, and not just a Czech company, but also a Romanian company can start that can also produce ammunition, or there can be, or the tanks that are produced by Rheinmetall in Germany, that they could be produced in Estonia. Bit complicated given the geopolitical situation, but that's the part that I mean. That common understanding of some sort of a division of labor among the member states so that each of them gets their part, which I understand.
But it's a planned economy. You were living in that. That's the problem. And you said it yourself, you don't give away. On the market, you don't give away anything. You just offer products, and if they are not bought, you don't have the money to continue. And that's the difference between the American thinking, which is always connected, and Chinese, by the way, with some risk. You enter the market and you have a risk to manage. In Europe, there is no risk. If you are a French company that makes the French weapons, there's no risk. That's the problem. So we need to reintroduce risk and bankruptcy and markets into this area, because in the world, the driver for change in military affairs is no longer the state program. They can seed something and shift it towards some direction. But that the business mechanism takes over, and through the sheer power of meritocratic measurement of performance on the market, they achieve something truly marvelous. America every year sets the space 160 rockets. 160. China 67. Still a lot. Russia in the war, it was difficult. 17. Europe 3. We missed this whole train, and we are still thinking how to, make the square circled, or circle square, that's what you call. Because Stoltenberg said a funny thing once. He said, I was very pro-markets when I was the Prime Minister of Norway, and we were to procure the new frigates for the Norwegian Navy. And I said, what? Let's not have a competition. They said, no, it's too dangerous and there will be repercussions and it's political. I said, no, we'll do a competition. And we bought a beautiful, cheaper Spanish frigates. And then I, of course, lost the elections immediately because of the workforce and etc. and the parties. It's too dependent and too secure. I love European mentality to be changed, to accept and understand the risk and take it, and move forward. But Europe is too much focused on not losing, not letting anyone lose. That it forgot how it feels to do some winning.
And then at the end of the day, I think that manifests in what you said much earlier about not having this growth that we've seen in other markets, in China, in the US, and then not be able to produce in any efficient way when it's needed because the capacity is not here.
We don't produce cell phones.
Yeah, the capacity just doesn't exist.
And when the when the shits hit the fan, we're gonna need those basic things as much as we need the weapons. The cell phones is a thing you use every day, and I'm so ashamed by the fact that we were making the best cell phones in the world, and we went to zero production. There's no one using European cell phones. There are none. There's something fundamentally wrong with our markets that doesn't allow products so useful and ubiquitous like cell phone to be made in Europe.
Okay, then I think I want to ask you the last question, which is nowadays NATO stronger, more cohesive, more homogeneous, or this reaction after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was just momentary?
NATO is definitely bigger and more suited to fulfill its goal, and the goal is smaller. And now it needs a little bit of explanation. You were starting with NATO, then shifted to Europe, and let's get back to NATO, because NATO has a clear geopolitical purpose. Stability of Europe within the American design of the world that serves American purpose. Let's not, play hide and seek. No. That's stabilizing Europe. Europeans become lazy, and we already talked about it. But also, China is now the bigger player and the bigger power in Asia than Russia ever was. Russia lost its empire, which gave NATO a big boost, and Russia a bellicose matter to put forward, which is the war that's happening now. The reaction was slightly like this yin-yang wu-wei thing. When they attacked the Ukraine south, we pushed through the north through Finland and Sweden and stabilized the northern flank of eastern flank, northern part of the eastern flank. I think northern parts will be very much important, and the US will rely in our hemisphere on NATO, in their hemisphere on NORAD, or in maybe Canada and Japan, etc. But NATO will still be a vital part. The problem is the credibility, because we are paying a price for not being able to win the two wars that we were fighting, despite of trying to insulate ourselves. The war in Afghanistan is a big flop. We are not able to take it and take some lessons from it. It's very hard to learn from history, but I think it's very... The war in Ukraine doesn't look to be a winning story as we speak. But there was a time where all it needed was a firm commitment to a war goal of 2022 borders, for example. Let's push the big invasion back where it came from. Let's count the money and let's do it properly. Never done it. We never, agreed on the bill to pay and the capabilities to deliver to the Ukrainians. And there was a time when Ukraine was able to really push back, but not anymore. So the problem is the credibility. And the biggest problem, of course, is that every alliance that America started needs to have a value for America and value for us. And the question of value of NATO is the central question of NATO's successful existence in the 21st century. Europeans should understand they are never able to pull off the effective defense of the continent without our superpower friends. Because there is no way, I don't see it, at least myself, to try to be friend with Russia or be friend with China doesn't bring more security. To be friend with the US is difficult, but it definitely has a clear defense value. And NATO grew a lot, which is like an overstretch. So it's definitely not yes on those last qualities you mentioned. More homogeneous? Never. It's bigger, more diverse. What else did you attribute more?
Cooperation.
Cooperation. It's still the old creature of sovereign consent. So it's moving at the speed of the slowest car in the column. So it's working. But the speed is not great. Speed is not great. but it's also very much able to be credible, sustain its policies over time. NATO is doing terrific things in high tech now. NATO is learning a lot from the Ukrainian conflict, much more than from Afghanistan, where we used to talk about it. And the NATO's task is not the biggest one in the world. It's still Russia. Nobody really wants NATO to be a bulwark against China. They need the diplomatic value of the Western alliance, which NATO is a vital part, but never to defend. But to defend against Russia, it's the, economy in the size of Netherlands, is within the European remit.
It's very small.
And America wants us to do it ourselves with their help in nuclear, etc. But we are still unable. Europe is making less munition than Russia. We are still laughing in Russia, but they do more every day. It's not the best quality. It suffices. On the battlefield, it doesn't really matter. So they, together with North Korea, another laughable country, are helping themselves better than we are helping Ukraine. And then comes the European treacherous nature of buying the Russian oil, etc. So they want us to grow. And the answer to your previous question, whether they will be okay if Europe is more independent, in the end, yes, and they will respect us. But if you are unable to achieve that, we will be divided, weak and dependent. They will treat us as such. Yeah, there is no way around it.
Like you said, poor quality ammunition is still better than no ammunition at all. And I think the last thought I just had, which is how the US actually has acted in other alliance structures. They preferred smaller. If we look, obviously, from the Australian perspective, we have AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, and then we have different US-led trilateral security arrangements. Exactly. And where they haven't preferred to have this big monolithic thing, which, as you said, is kind of slow moving. And this is why when people ask me if I think there's going to be sort of a NATO of the Indo-Pacific, and I think definitely not. No, US doesn't want that. No. They like this smaller, more movable, more mobile units where they can have more of an influence on...
It also works with the direction of the space station.
But just imagine having something smaller between US and Slovenia. It doesn't work. So you need to bundle up the European countries.
Exactly.
In Indo-Pacific, it's much better, thanks to the size and also the alliance history. I think, cornerstone is Japan, still. And there is this idea of having the cornerstone balancer, as Colby puts it, right?
Yeah.
So at least when US is credible to be your guarantee in Australia, you will do very well. And your currency, by the way, is one of the most sought after in these tumultuous times. Australian dollar, because you are geopolitically stable and have a sizable economy with resources in it. And that's a program for Europe, to have resources in, a sizable economy, and US support. That's the way to security.
Well, that was fantastic. I really think very much enjoyed the conversation today with you, Jakub. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Jakub.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I learned so much. And I loved your thesis. By the way, good luck on Friday.
Let's see. Hopefully it will go. It will be. But yeah, thank you very much, Jakub, my pleasure for coming here today. And well, thank you all very much for listening. It's been a while, but hopefully we can come up with some more episodes soon. And we'll definitely keep on having all these conversations that are right now at every table. So thank you very much, and let's see each other next time in a new episode of the Geopolitical Pico. Ciao, ciao. The Geopolitical Pico is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram at The Geopolitical Pico or Twitter at The Geopico for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.